Welcome to the WTR Small-Cap Spotlight podcast. I'm your host, Tim Gerdeman, Vice Chair and Co-founder and Chief Marketing Officer of Water Tower Research. In today's podcast episode, I'm joined by Ruella Menezes, Director of Energy with the Management Consulting Practice at Kline Company. Kline Company is a global market research and advisory firm that provides strategic advisory and robust market intelligence across various industries. The firm is a trusted leader, especially known for expertise in energy and specialty chemical sectors. At Kline Company, Ruella leads the new energy business unit, advising clients on strategic decisions in the evolving energy sector. Prior to Kline, she spent nearly a decade at Accenture supporting the energy and chemicals practice. I would be remiss if I did not mention that I'm a proud Kline Company alum from the late 80s and early 90s as my first employer post-grad school, and I would not be sitting in this seat today had I not been there for 3 years and gained that invaluable experience. Lastly, a special shout out to my Kline Company buddy and Chairman and CEO Joe Tarantola. Also joining us is my WTR colleague, Peter Gastreich. Good morning, Ruella and Peter, and thank you for joining today's podcast.
Good morning, Tim. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning.
Ruella, could you please provide background on Kline Company for those listeners who might not be familiar with the firm, describe your role and team at Kline, and provide an overview of Kline's interest and capabilities in SAF research?
Sure, Tim. So Kline is a global market intelligence and advisory firm, bringing in over 6 decades of experience in decoding some of the most intricate B2B value chains. With more than 200 consultants spread across 11 offices globally, we operate at both global as well as a local reach. What differentiates Kline is our ability to combine data-driven insights with deep technical sector and local market expertise. We serve a broad portfolio of industries, right from lubricants and chemicals to alternative feedstocks, as well as emerging fuels. Now, in the SAF space, where Kline really comes in is Kline acts as a system-level advisor, helping our clients navigate uncertainty, anticipate what's coming next, so that they are better positioned to win in the SAF market.
Excellent. And also, before I turn the call over to Peter or Ruella to ask some very specific granular questions on SAF, I always like to ask our podcast guests to tell our audience about their professional backgrounds, if you would, please.
Sure, Tim. So, I usually describe my professional journey as one that blends a foundation in chemistry with a career in strategic advisory. So I completed my BSc in chemistry and later on, went on to pursue my master's in management from the University of Strathclyde in UK. So at a very early stage in my career, I found myself, at the intersection of science, business, and real-world problem solving. And since then, I've spent my career working with several advisory firms across chemical and the oil and gas sector. I was with Accenture for nearly a decade, and in the chemicals and energy practice, working with them for across the different consulting divisions. And before that, with Avalon Global Research for almost 3 years. I've now been with Kline for close to about 2.5 years. And it's that mix of chemistry and management thinking that ultimately drew me, towards the energy transition space.
That's a great background for your current role, so thanks for sharing. Peter, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Tim. So, Ruella, let's start with a high-level question for any new listeners who may not yet be familiar with sustainable aviation fuel, and that is simply, what is SAF?
I think that's a great, question, and it really is important to understand the basics of, understanding what SAF really is. So SAF, Peter, in simple terms, is sustainable aviation fuel, and it's cleaner, more sustainable than the traditional jet fuel that we talk of today. Now, what makes it cleaner is that it's produced from everyday waste materials, like used cooking oil, animal fats, and forest residues. Chemically, it works almost exactly like regular jet fuel. So airlines can use it without any modification in their aircraft. But I think when we really talk about, what is SAF, it's also very important to understand why does SAF really matter and what's the environmental proposition that we're really after, right? So jet fuel is very energy dense. And it is this energy density that allows aircrafts to fly across the world, carrying so many passengers. And today, if you look at the aviation industry, it's contributing a significant amount of, carbon emissions. And at the moment, there's no practical substitute that can deliver the same performance at scale. So this is where we see, SAF coming in. And where I feel SAF really plays an important role, it is that it helps bend the carbon intensity curve. And this is what we're really looking for in the sustainability space today.
Okay, thanks. That's a great intro for SAF. So, clearly very important for airline decarbonization. So how would you frame the long-term demand outlook for SAF, and what would be the key drivers for it?
Yeah, so I think when we look at the long-term demand outlook for SAF, one thing is absolutely clear, which is that demand is going to grow sharply and persistently for decades. And this isn't going to be a small change. It's going to be a structural shift in terms of how aviation will be powered. Now, if you take a 2050 view, Kline estimates suggest that globally SAF demand is going to expand from roughly 1 million metric tons that was consumed in 2024 to somewhere between 150 to 300 million tons in 2050. Now, obviously, this is depending upon, the scenario that you take, whether you take a conservative, optimistic, or a highly ambitious scenario. Now, even in the conservative scenario, we do see a double-digit growth every year for the next 2 decades. What this means is that SAF will increasingly become the backbone of aviation's decarbonization strategy. And to answer your the second question that you had for me, which is around the key drivers, I believe that there are a few powerful forces at play here. The first one being mandates. Now, this is by far the biggest driver. Today, you see governments that are now putting binding blending requirements in place. You have Europe and the UK, for example, that have already placed their SAF mandates, which have started in 2025 itself. And in 2025, we're looking at roughly 2% of SAF blending, but those percentages are supposed to climb, or rather expected to climb steadily over time. And it's not just Europe that we're looking at here. We're looking at similar moves in Japan, Singapore, Canada, and parts of the US as well. Now, the moment a mandate is introduced, what happens is that demand becomes predictable, which means that airlines have to buy it, producers have to make it, and investors suddenly feel confident financing new plans. So this is when we see a real market, being formed. A second important driver that I feel is, the net zero commitments that airlines have today. Nearly every, major airline has a 2050 net zero pathway in place today. Hydrogen aircrafts and electric aircrafts will play a role, but only in niche segments and mostly post 2040. So for long haul flying, which is where most of emissions come from today, SAF is the only scalable solution. And airlines today see it not as an essential, they see it as an essential, but not optional. Lastly, corporate customers are becoming a demand engine of their own. So, today you have book and claim systems where big corporate firms, such as those operating in the banking, in the financing and consulting industry, have started to buy SAF certificates to address their Scope 3 travel emissions. And what's interesting is that this demand tends to be quite strong, and it's creating a whole new layer of demand that's sitting on top of airline requirements today. So when you put mandates, airline commitments, corporate demands together, what you get is a really powerful set of forces that's pushing SAF forward.
Wow, that's amazing. So it sounds like we're looking more than a 100x demand growth potential from where we were, for example, last year. So, but meanwhile, someone has to pay for that as well, and of course, fuel itself is a big expense for airlines. So how should we think about the affordability and how airlines will be able to absorb the higher costs of SAF when compared to fossil jet fuel?
I think that's a very, very important question, because when we talk about SAF affordability today, I think the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that the cost gap is real. SAF today is 2 to 5 times more expensive than your traditional jet fuel. And because jet fuel accounts for roughly 30 to 40% of an airline's operating costs, airlines simply can't absorb the premium straight onto their books. So then the question arises, right? How do airlines manage this? And here I see three main levers. The first one is policy support and market mechanisms, where we are seeing mandates, incentives, tax credits that are essential today to narrow this gap between to narrow this price gap mainly, so that airlines and producers can operate in the SAF market space. The second most important thing is long-term offtake agreements. And here we are seeing, more multi-year SAF deals that are getting signed. And what this is doing, it's helping stabilize pricing, as well as giving producers the confidence that that is needed to invest in new capacity. Lastly, we do see cost reductions to come over time. So as technology matures, supply chains scale, and more capacity comes online, SAF should move down the cost curve. But Peter, to be honest, I think all this looks good in theory, and the reality is much more complicated. Today, there are some airlines that genuinely want to lead, but then they're also worried about being disadvantaged if competitors don't make the same commitments. And in a low margin industry, this sort of imbalance is just not sustainable, which is why mandates play a very important role. And the landscape today, unfortunately, is mixed. Today you have some airlines that buy SAF voluntarily, some who just meet the mandate, and then there are some airlines that are getting very creative. What do I mean by getting creative? Is some airlines have started optimizing their routes so that they can minimize the uplift at the airports with SAF mandates. And this shows, how sensitive the economics really is. And to put this in context, right, if we just look at the price of jet fuel in 2025 alone, we have the average price of jet fuel to be around $86 per barrel in 2025, which seen a significant drop from 2024 numbers. So in 2024, if I have to compare, the jet fuel price from 2024, we did see a 13% drop, which is big savings for the aviation industry, right? And now, if you compare that to what's happened with respect to SAF, we see that SAF prices have skyrocketed. We have SAF, which has costed almost 4.2 times that of jet fuel in 2025 alone. And this is partly due to the compliance phase as suppliers prepare for Europe's 2% SAF mandate. So it's not a simple affordability question, and I think the question is much more complicated than it seems. We feel that airlines are trying to balance sustainability commitments with long-term economic reality, situation in mind. So until the cost gap narrows and policies stabilize, SAF uptake will continue to grow, but there'll always still be a lag.
Okay, got it. Thank you. So, but now taking this ambitious demand outlook into account, which you've outlined so well, let's turn to the supply side of the equation here. So, what are the prospects of SAF supply, keeping pace with this aggressive demand growth, and whatever horizon makes sense on a 5-year horizon or over the long term?
Yeah, so I think when we look at the next 5 years, I'd actually say SAF supply can keep pace with demand, but only if projects get built on time. So if I look at, Kline SAF outlook today, so our numbers suggest that demand is expected to rise somewhere between 12 and 15 million tons by 2030. And on paper, there's roughly 19 to 20 million tons of announced capacity. So in theory, the volumes are there. But then there's a caveat here. Over the last couple of years, we've seen projects being paused, delayed, or even cancelled. And that's happened across the EU, the UK, and even parts of the US. So if this pattern continues, supply will fall behind demand very quickly. Now, over the long term, we do see, dynamics to start shifting. And what I mean by that is demand accelerates much faster than what HEFA alone can support. And that's when we see pathways like Fischer-Tropsch, alcohol to jet, as well as e-fuels becoming absolutely essential. So these are the technologies that are going to start playing a very important role in the future. But then again, the need for strong policy support and steady pipeline is what is going to really be the key driver.
Okay, great. I'd like to come back to some of those other technologies in just a moment here, but maybe we can focus a bit more, on the leading kind of SAF production process today. I mean, there's a lot of technologies, as you mentioned, but I understand that the HEFA process, which uses feedstocks like fats and greases and used cooking oil, is by far the dominant technology at present. Why has that technology been leading the race so far?
So, Peter, HEFA today is a dominant SAF pathway right now for a very simple reason. One, it is the most mature. Two, it's commercially ready. And three, it's the lowest risk technology that's available today. There are few big factors behind this dominance. So the first one being the technology is proven. HEFA uses, the well-understood hydro-treating and hydro-cracking process, the same unit operations that refineries have been using for decades. That means producers can adapt existing refinery infrastructure rather than building, brand new ones from scratch. So from an engineering and financing standpoint, that massively reduces the risk. Second, feedstocks are available today. You have your waste oil, fats, greases, and used cooking oils that are readily available today and are already being collected at scale around the world. So you don't really need new investments in terms of innovation to use these sort of feedstocks. Third, the certification pathway is straightforward because HEFA fuels were among the first to be approved under ASTM standards for aviation. Airlines have flown millions of miles using HEFA blends. This has created confidence and regulators trust it, airlines trust it, and engine manufacturers trust it. So fourth, it's the most cost-effective pathway right now. So while still more expensive than jet fuel, HEFA is significantly cheaper and more efficient than other pathways like Fischer-Tropsch, alcohol to jet, power to liquid. And in a world where SAF is 2 to 5 times more expensive than kerosene, low-cost pathways will dominate.
Okay, thanks, Ruella. That's been a great overview in terms of the in terms of the HEFA process. I do understand that from what a lot of experts have said is that HEFA is potentially going to be running into feedstock constraints, potentially as early as 2030. Do you think that's the case? And if so, amongst those other kind of production pathways that you mentioned, what do you think are going to be the leaders beyond HEFA?
So, yeah, the concerns about HEFA running into feedstock constraints is absolutely valid. And it's arguably one of the biggest structural challenges in the SAF market today. So today, if you look at HEFA, right, it relies on feedstocks such as used cooking oil, tallow, fats, greases, and some renewable oil seeds. But the fundamental issue has always been about supply, because these waste feedstocks simply aren't available at scale, especially the scale that the aviation industry will need from it in the long term. But what's making this, this equation or this question about, HEFA feedstock constraints a little tricky at the moment is, change in policies that we're seeing. For example, if you look at the One Big Beautiful bill, right, which made several important changes to the clean fuel production credit or the 45Z recently. What changes did happen today is mainly around, the rules for feedstock eligibility. So what happens right now is the feedstocks need to be produced or grown in North America itself. And secondly, the model needs to be adjusted to exclude emissions from indirect land use change. Now, what this does is it opens up opportunities for agricultural oils such as soybean oil. So in theory, HEFA could run into a feedstock constraint. But with this new regulation, that could shift the tipping point completely. So if US grown, soybean oil or the other domestic oil seeds start getting used at scale under the 45Z, it might expand the feedstock pool beyond waste oils and fats. So yes, HEFA will run into constraints, but it's not a question of if, but when. And today we do have a lot of different pathways that are being tested out. Three of them stand out for me, which is, one, the Fischer-Tropsch process, which is, converting biomass or waste into liquids. The Fischer-Tropsch process, has been one of the most commercially mature non-lipid SAF pathways that converts biomass, municipal solid waste, or other carbon-rich feedstocks into synthetic crude, which is then upgraded into jet fuel. Several large-scale projects are currently under development globally, and Fischer-Tropsch benefits from decades of industrial experience in gasification and synthetic fuels. The only challenge I feel in scaling this technology is the high capital intensity and long construction timelines, along with project bankability that hinges on long-term feedstock security. The second pathway I feel is alcohol to jet, which does have a good promise in the future. This is an ASTM approved pathway, and several producers today are moving through commercialization, especially in the US and Europe. Lastly, we have power to liquids, which I feel is emerging as the long-term high-impact pathway. A number of demonstration and early commercial projects are underway, primarily in Europe and the Middle East. I feel the outlook for e-fuels is almost considered to be a transformative pathway in the long term, but will require substantial cost reductions and infrastructure build-outs before they reach true meaningful scale.
Okay, got it. That's great. So let's move over to a topic that I'm sure keeps you very busy, in particular earlier this year with the changes in Washington, but and that's policy. Always a fun topic, very dynamic. So, but that is just really like what role do federal and state policies in the U.S. play in terms of shaping the SAF market, and how do any inconsistencies between those levels, federal versus state, affect producers?
Well, that's a great question, Peter. To be honest, federal and state policies play a very important role in shaping the SAF market. And honestly, I feel they are one of the biggest determinants of whether a project even gets built. So like I've been saying, all the while, that SAF is still 2 to 5 times more expensive than fossil jet fuel. So without strong policy support, the economics simply don't work out. And at a federal level, incentives like the 45Z Clean Fuel Production Credit have been transformative. They bring down the effective cost of SAF and give producers the revenue certainty they need to raise capital for large, first-of-a-kind plants. Then you have state-level policies layered on top, such as the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, the Washington's, Clean Fuel Standard, and so on. But things get complicated. Where things get complicated is when there's a disconnect or a misalignment between federal and state rules. Take California's, GREET model, for instance. This does not consider indirect land use change. So a fuel that looks low carbon under the new federal rules might look a lot dirtier under the California system. And what this means is it means it's going to earn fewer LCFS credits. And this is not just about life cycle modeling, right? You're also looking at several other disconnects. For example, if you look at feedstock, the way feedstock is treated. The federal government now penalizes imported feedstocks with a 20% haircut. The states, they don't really, on the contrary, I feel they give importance to feedstocks such as wastes, fats, and used cooking oil, primarily because they are much lower in their carbon intensity score. So now what this does is that producers, end up feeling trapped between two frameworks that don't always agree on what clean actually means. And when these two frameworks don't really match, producers end up with uncertainty, squeezed margins, and complicated supply chains that they need to deal with.
And let's turn to overseas markets. So, what are the important regulatory changes overseas, including in the EU and UK, and what are the implications for the US SAF projects?
I think that's a great question, Peter. And I'd like to answer this question by first looking at the European market, and then let's try and understand what's happening in the UK so that I can then talk about what does this really mean for US SAF projects. So if we look at what's happening in the Europe right now, right, you have the Europe Refuel EU Aviation Regulation that mandates SAF blending. And this SAF blending, as I said, keeps increasing over the years. So it starts with 2% blending mandate in 2025, rising up to 6% in 2030, and then aiming for, close to about 70% in 2050. What's interesting, it also has sub-mandates for synthetic fuels. Now, apart from these mandates that are in place, when it comes to Europe, you also have the Europe ETS, or the Europe Emission Trading System, that's getting tougher on aviation. What's happening right now is that the free allowances for airlines are going to be soon phased out, and they're going to be phased out completely by 2026. So carriers will have to buy allowances for almost all their emissions. So from a US perspective, what EU means for them is it has created a guaranteed, incrementally growing SAF demand curve, plus a carbon price signal that makes fossil jet progressively going to be more painful. Now, if you look at what's happening in the UK, right? In the UK, again, we do see these mandates, which started with 2% SAF, and this is also going to gradually increase to 22% by 2040. In the UK, we, like the EU, we also do see sub-mandates for, e-fuels. But what makes the UK market interesting is that there's a HEFA cap to avoid over-reliance on waste oils and make room for advanced pathways. So HEFA, the HEFA pathway will soon be having different caps on it. So HEFA pathway will be permitted until 2026, but we'll see a gradual drop over the years as we go. Now, what do we learn from this, right? So the UK is not just saying use SAF, but it's steering the mix towards advanced and synthetic fuels with caps, sub-targets, and penalties. Now, let's try and understand what does this really mean for US SAF projects, right? And I'd like to frame this implication in 3 buckets. The first one being it creates a guaranteed export market, provided you meet the rules. So the EU and UK, what they've done is they have created a locked-in long-term demand for SAF with clear percentages laid out for until 2040 and 2050. What this does is it opens doors for US producers to export SAF, including HEFA, as well as eSAF in the long run. But there's one caveat here, which is that US producers will have to start looking to sell SAF into the EU and UK market by meeting very strict sustainability and traceability rules. So they will have to start adhering to the different certifications that are needed. They will have to ensure that they have full proof of feedstock, origin, land use history, detailed reporting, as well as chain of custody requirements. In other words, for a US project, it becomes very important to design for a EU-UK compliance from day one when they make a strategic decision, to invest in a plant. And the second implication that I see is there's a strong pull for advanced and eSAF mandates, and it's just not going to be HEFA. So because the EU and UK have these synthetic fuel sub-mandates, and in the UK's case, a HEFA cap, what these 2 markets are doing is they're sending a very clear signal, which says that we'll need a lot of HEFA, but from 2030 onwards, we also want Fisher troughs, alcohol to jet, and eSAF supply coming into play. So this, again, creates an opportunity for US SAF projects to cater to this market. And lastly, location is going to be a key decision factor that SAF producers will need to start thinking about. Some US developers will stick to a made in US and export it to Europe UK model, especially if they can stack US tax credits with an EU UK price premium. While others might just decide it's better to co-locate in or near the UK mandates. So either way, US projects are now planning in a world where overseas policy is as important as domestic policy, especially when you're building a 20-year-old asset.
So we've covered a lot here. It's been very comprehensive today. I wonder if you kind of take into consideration, just in kind of conclusion here, everything that we have discussed. What would you say are the biggest risks to this outlook which you have given us?
So there are really four major risks to the SAF outlook that I see. The first one is policy uncertainty. Right now, SAF uptake is fundamentally policy-led. Without mandates or incentives, the economics simply don't close. So imagine a world where, those incentives lapse or mandates weaken. The market would stall almost overnight. So this really shows you how important, policy is when we talk about the future of SAF. The second one is policy fragmentation. Different regions are defining clean fuel in different ways. They're having different carbon intensity scores, different feedstock rules, different eligibility criteria. And if this divergence continues, it's going to become incredibly difficult for SAF to scale. Airlines won't really know what qualifies where, and producers won't know where to invest or which standards to build for. The third important factor here is feedstock definition and alignment. So what's happening right now is every region has its own preferred feedstock or its own carbon intensity scoring frameworks. So what's going to happen if there is no balance or clarity on what's acceptable and what's scalable? Long-term supply planning is also going to start becoming difficult. And then lastly, the big one, which is economics. At the moment, ongoing SAF price suggests SAF being more expensive than the cost of jet fuel. Airlines can't absorb the premium on their P&L. So unless costs fall and policies remain supportive, adoption will be slow. What's important is also we are moving from a HEFA-dominated market into a one in the future where we will see, Fisher Troughs, alcohol to jet, and eSAF having a much bigger role to play. But when these pathways kick in or get introduced to the market, what's going to happen is they are going to be 5 to 9 times more expensive than ever. So the question is, how will economics really work? So these are some of the questions that we need to really think of when we think of the outlook for SAF. So if I had to sum it up, the biggest risks that I see today is policy uncertainty, policy alignment, feedstock certainty, and the ability to close the economic gap. I genuinely feel, that the industry is learning. Governments are engaging much more closely with industry participants to understand the real challenges on the ground. So the road ahead is definitely difficult, but it's not impossible. With collaborations, the right policies, and continued innovation, we will get there.
Okay, that's great. So thank you so much, Ruella. It's been an absolute pleasure having you join us today. And I know that your insights are going to be super helpful to our audience of both investors and corporates who are navigating this space. We'll definitely be collaborating with Ruella and Kline Company in a future event. So please stay tuned to Water Tower Research for that. For more on Kline Company, please take a look at the firm's website, www.klinegroup.com. Also, for investors interested in listed companies in the SAF and renewable fuels space, anyone can sign up for our complimentary research content on the WTR website. We cover Abundia, Comstock Incorporated, Darling Ingredients, Gevo, Green Plains, Nesta, and Valero Energy. You'll also find podcast interviews on many more companies in the renewable fuels space. And with that, Tim, I'll pass back over to you.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Ruella, thank you so much for being generous with your time for our audience today. I know it's nighttime in India, so you went above and beyond for this podcast today. And we're excited to have Kline Company back on in the future moving forward. So thanks both and have a great day. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe, as well as visiting www.watertowerresearch.com to stay up to speed on the company's small cap written research reports, podcasts, fireside chats, industry-specific symposiums, and conference schedules. We will see you next time for another edition of the WTR Small-Cap Spotlight podcast. Finally, a special thanks to the producer and editor of the podcast, Krista Fitzpatrick.